The Convergence of Theory and Arithmetic. A comprehensive analysis of the historic congressional fiscal inquiry. The historical event in question unfolded with a level of surgical precision that one might typically associate with high-stakes laboratory experiments, occurring at the exact temporal marker of 11:34 a.m. on a standard Wednesday morning in the month of March. This specific moment was not merely a point on a calendar, but rather the singular, defining juncture, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez encountered a formidable intellectual and practical challenge. A challenge she had successfully, and perhaps miraculously, maneuvered around or completely bypassed throughout the entirety of her high-profile, 6-year political career. The unyielding and impartial principles of fundamental mathematics. It is essential to clarify that this was not the performative, often superficial arithmetic frequently deployed on digital social media landscapes such as X, formerly Twitter, or TikTok. In those virtual domains, complex economic variables, multi-layered fiscal policies, and nuanced social theories are frequently reduced to simplistic, populist slogans designed for rapid consumption by a base that prioritizes emotional resonance over empirical accuracy. Such digital rhetoric often focuses on the perceived excess of billionaires or fluctuates job growth figures in a manner meant for viral distribution rather than academic scrutiny. Nor was this the specific variety of calculation involving unread legislative studies, obscure white papers, or the vague trillion-dollar estimates often cited in brief, high-energy video segments where numbers are tossed around like rhetorical confetti for their immediate atmospheric effect. Instead, this was objective, undeniable, and cold mathematics, the exact variety that necessitates the physical presence of a calculating device. It was the kind of arithmetic where the input must, by the very laws of logic, reconcile perfectly with the output, and where the invisible but powerful force of fiscal gravity finally exerts its unavoidable pressure on even the most lofty of political ambitions. This situation represented the kind of intense, granular scrutiny where a legislator, regardless of their charisma or public following, cannot simply rely on the rhythmic, predictable applause of a sympathetic and ideologically aligned crowd by promising to shift the entirety of the national financial burden onto the shoulders of the affluent. On the contrary, it was a direct, face-to-face encounter with a tangible, physical electronic device and a formal request from an interlocutor, one possessing a subtle, deceptively calm Southern drawl, to demonstrate the underlying work in front of a live, global television audience estimated to exceed 38 million observers. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man known for his sharp intellect, hidden behind a veneer of rural simplicity, was positioned with poise across the witness table. He performed a physical gesture that would, within mere minutes, transition from a simple movement into an iconic piece of political history. He reached down and slid a modest $5 retail calculator, the specific variety featuring oversized, tactile buttons typically associated with basic household budgeting or elementary accounting, across the polished mahogany surface toward the Congresswoman. He made this request with a demeanor that was strategically polite, almost apologetic in its tone, asking that she simply aggregate the various revenue streams intended to fully capitalize the very legislative proposals she had championed with such vigor for over half a decade. These initiatives, often framed as essential for the salvation of the national fabric and the achievement of long-overdue environmental justice, were promised to generate millions of high-paying jobs with minimal fiscal friction, all viewed through the optimistic lens of modern monetary theory. As Ocasio-Cortez observed, the small plastic device moving toward her, her usual aura of unshakable confidence seemed to undergo a visible, rapid erosion. Her hands, which are typically steady and expressive, when she addresses her vast digital audience or gestures during routine committee proceedings, exhibited a slight but noticeable tremor as she reached out to accept the device. Beneath the intense, unforgiving lighting of the Senate hearing room, the professional and meticulously cultivated aesthetic, she had made her trademark the signature red blazer, and the specific shade of lipstick suddenly took on the visual quality of a costume. It appeared as if the heavy, complex reality of high-stakes governance had finally pierced the protective veil of social media stardom. The atmosphere within the chamber underwent a profound transition, settling into a heavy, uncomfortable, and nearly suffocating silence. This was not the silence of respect or contemplation, but rather the collective realization of a room full of experts and observers that a prominent political figure was currently operating significantly out of her intellectual depth. There was a palpable shift in perception. The idea that an influential public persona, supported by tens of millions of followers and optimized by favorable media lighting, was in the process of being systematically dismantled by the cold, impartial reality of raw figures. This realization was not confined to the room. It was shared by millions of viewers across C-SPAN, CNN, and Fox News. They watched in real time as a seasoned politician struggled to reconcile a 45-minute ideological speech about a $10 trillion to $15 trillion economic transformation with the total and glaring absence of even the most basic, preliminary arithmetic. It became evident that while she had spent years advocating for legislation that her extensive staff had likely written, and she had perhaps only reviewed in summary, and while she had participated in countless interviews with friendly media hosts who never dared to ask a challenging question, she had never actually sat down with a calculator to verify if her grand vision was grounded in any form of material reality. Senator Kennedy, despite his unassuming outward appearance and his well-practiced country lawyer persona, possessed a formidable and sophisticated intellectual background. Having mastered the complexities of economics at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and having served for 3 decades as the state treasurer of Louisiana, he was perhaps the most overqualified individual in the building to conduct such an audit. He initiated his line of inquiry with a deceptive, almost grandfatherly friendliness, offering high praise for the Congresswoman's undeniable passion and dedication to her cause. However, he then pivoted to a request for a basic ballpark figure regarding the total capital investment required over the next 10 years to realize her agenda. Ocasio-Cortez provided an estimate suggesting the necessary investment would fall between $10 trillion and $15 trillion over a decade. Kennedy, with the speed of a professional treasurer, immediately calculated this as an annual federal expenditure of roughly $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. When he asked where this immense, unprecedented sum of money would originate, she responded with her standard, well-rehearsed talking points regarding a more progressive tax system, the closing of complex corporate loopholes, and the inherent fiscal flexibility supposedly provided by the tenets of modern monetary theory. Kennedy listened with practiced patience, nodding as she spoke, before pressing for specific annual revenue estimates that would be generated specifically from a proposed 70% marginal tax rate on annual income exceeding $10 million, alongside a new wealth tax on fortunes surpassing $50 million. While she appeared to lack exact, verified figures in that moment, she suggested that these measures would raise several $100 billion annually. Kennedy, showing a sense of strategic generosity, rounded her estimate up to a full $500 billion. In doing so, he highlighted a glaring, massive annual shortfall of approximately $1 trillion, a fiscal gap that remained entirely unaddressed. As the questioning intensified and the pressure in the room mounted, Kennedy introduced nonpartisan data sourced directly from the Congressional Budget Office. He noted that a 70% marginal rate on income over $10 million would realistically generate only approximately $43 billion per year, primarily because of the very small number of American households that actually fall into that rarefied tax bracket. He continued to methodically and calmly dismantle her revenue assumptions, citing Department of the Treasury estimates, which indicated that a national wealth tax would likely raise between $200 billion and $300 billion annually. He noted that these figures assumed a state of perfect compliance and the total absence of capital flight, two conditions that he pointed out were historically unprecedented and virtually impossible in a globalized economy. After reviewing all proposed revenue streams, including significant corporate tax increases, new carbon taxes, and the aggressive closing of loopholes, the absolute total reached only about $600 billion per year. This calculation exposed a massive structural annual deficit of $400 billion to $900 billion, which would be added on top of existing federal deficits. Ocasio-Cortez, visibly struggling to find a response, could not account for this discrepancy despite her repeated claims regarding economic multiplier effects and induced macroeconomic growth. When Kennedy eventually provided the physical calculator and invited her to sum her own tax proposals herself, the resulting total of $605 billion served as a stark, undeniable confirmation of the significant shortfall against her spending goals of up to $1.5 trillion annually. Kennedy emphasized that after 6 years of public advocacy and national debate, she had yet to produce a viable, mathematically sound financing plan. He stated with a somber tone that passion is simply not enough when the task at hand is the management of trillion-dollar national budgets that affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The focus of the scrutiny then shifted toward the specific, granular mechanics of job creation. Kennedy calculated that a $1.5 trillion annual budget intended to create 2 million jobs per year resulted in a staggering cost of $750,000 per individual job. He pointed out that since the median American worker earns approximately $54,000 a year, the government could effectively pay their full salaries directly for 14 years, with that amount of capital. He then asked a pointed personal question. Would she ever invest her own personal funds in a business proposal that featured such a disastrous 10-to-1 cost-to-income ratio? The inquiry then turned toward the subject of residential solar power, which had been presented as a cornerstone of the Green New Deal's energy transition. Kennedy demonstrated that the math regarding the number of physical installations required to meet her environmental targets was not just difficult, but physically impossible. Utilizing data provided by the Environmental Protection Agency, he noted that an average residential solar system offsets approximately 4 tons of carbon dioxide annually. To reach her specific target of reducing national emissions by 2 billion tons per year through residential solar alone, the United States would need to install panels on 500 million houses. However, as he pointed out, there are only about 140 million residential structures in the entire country. This meant that the plan required installing solar panels on every single house in America 3.5 times over, at a projected cost of $12.5 trillion for that single component of the plan alone. Kennedy also addressed her frequent citations of international models, specifically highlighting the extremely high electricity costs currently burdening the middle class in Germany. He also noted that Scandinavian countries like Denmark, which she often praised, apply high marginal tax rates to individuals earning as little as $60,000, a fact that stood in stark contrast to her rhetoric about only taxing the ultra-wealthy. Furthermore, he highlighted the historical fact that Sweden had repealed its own wealth tax in 1991 because it had triggered a massive exodus of capital and ultimately cost the government more in lost revenue than it had ever generated in elections. He questioned whether her policy goals were truly designed to maximize federal revenue or if they were instead intended to penalize financial success at any cost. In the concluding minutes of the session, Kennedy brought the discussion back to her own home district, New York's 14th. He noted her vocal and successful opposition to the Amazon HQ2 project, a development that would have brought 25,000 high-paying jobs to an area struggling with higher-than-average poverty and unemployment rates. Finally, he challenged her fundamental understanding of modern monetary theory and its relationship to the federal budget, illustrating that her roadmap would create permanent, structural deficits ranging from 9% to 11% of the total gross domestic product. When she found herself unable to explain how MMT would prevent hyperinflation without the implementation of massive broad-based taxation, the room fell into an excruciating, heavy silence that lasted for a full 60 seconds. Kennedy concluded the hearing by stating that if a legislator cannot answer elementary arithmetic questions about their own flagship proposal, it may not be a serious policy at all, but rather just a charismatic slogan. The aftermath of this hearing represented a tectonic, fundamental shift in the American political landscape. The calculator moment achieved instant, unprecedented virality across every major social media platform, garnering over 60 million views in the first 48 hours and becoming the primary trending topic globally. Media outlets across the entire political spectrum struggled to find a way to defend her performance. Even ideologically aligned economists like Paul Krugman were forced to write that good intentions and noble goals are insufficient without the presence of rigorous, defensible mathematical modeling. Within a matter of weeks, public support for the Green New Deal, which had once been a dominant policy framework, cratered from 58% to a mere 39%. Furthermore, a serious primary challenge emerged in the form of Marcus Rodriguez, a pragmatic candidate whose campaign launch video focused entirely on the vital importance of doing the math and garnered 5 million views in its first day. 1 year after the event, the Green New Deal was effectively dead in its original, expansive form, replaced by a series of more realistic, incremental, and fiscally grounded climate proposals. Ocasio-Cortez herself narrowly survived her primary election, but the experience changed her. She became far more cautious, detail-oriented, and measured in her subsequent policy claims. The ultimate and enduring legacy of the hearing was the widespread national realization that governance, at its most fundamental level, is an exercise in arithmetic. It served as a reminder that passion, rhetoric, and massive social media followings are no substitute for the cold, hard reality of mathematical certainty. Chapter 2. The Intellectual Pedigree of Fiscal Conservatism and the Architecture of the Rhodes Scholarship. To understand the gravity of the exchange, one must first examine the divergent intellectual journeys that led these two figures to that specific witness table. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana represents a tradition of academic rigor that is often obscured by his deliberate choice of a folksy, accessible vernacular. His journey through the hallowed halls of the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar provided him with a foundation in classical economic thought that prioritizes equilibrium, scarcity, and the tangible limitations of capital. The Rhodes Scholarship itself is not merely an academic accolade. It is a rigorous selection process that seeks individuals who possess both character and intellect. In the quiet libraries of Oxford, Kennedy mastered the nuances of macroeconomic stability, studying the historical failures of hyperinflationary environments and the delicate balance required to maintain a national currency's integrity. His subsequent 3 decades as the state treasurer of Louisiana served as a practical laboratory for these theories. In that role, he was responsible for the actual movement of billions of dollars, the management of pension funds, and the balancing of state budgets that could not rely on the theoretical safety net of a printing press. For Kennedy, a dollar was never a mere digital abstraction. It was a unit of labor, a representation of taxpayer sacrifice, and a finite resource that required meticulous stewardship. This background created a mind that views a $1 trillion deficit not as a political talking point, but as a structural threat to the stability of the next generation. In stark contrast, the intellectual framework of the modern progressive movement, as personified by the Congresswoman, is built upon the rapid-fire dissemination of ideas in the digital age. This is an era where the speed of a message often takes precedence over its mathematical depth. Her rise was characterized by a mastery of the new media ecosystem, where complex social grievances are condensed into high-impact visual content. This environment rewards passion, moral clarity, and the ability to mobilize large groups of people around a singular vision of justice. However, this same environment often lacks the mechanisms for rigorous peer review or fiscal stress testing. When she advocated for a total economic transformation, she was speaking to an audience that prioritizes the why over the how. Her background, while impressive in its grassroots organizational success, had not required her to reconcile a balance sheet under the pressure of nonpartisan auditing. The calculator moment was therefore more than just a political gaffe. It was the collision of two entirely different eras of American intellectual life, the era of the classical economist and the era of the digital influencer. Chapter 3: The Theoretical Mirage of Modern Monetary Theory and the Inflationary Trap. The fiscal proposals presented during the hearing were largely anchored in the burgeoning school of thought known as Modern Monetary Theory, or MMT. To the uninitiated, MMT offers a seductive promise that a country which issues its own sovereign currency can never truly run out of money in the traditional sense. Proponents argue that the primary constraint on government spending is not the availability of tax revenue, but rather the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services without triggering excessive inflation. In this theoretical world, the federal budget is not akin to a household budget. The government does not need to tax before it spends. Instead, it spends first and uses taxes later to regulate the money supply and control inflation. This theory provided the intellectual cover for the Congresswoman's claim that trillions of dollars could be injected into the economy for national salvation with minimal fiscal friction. It allowed for the framing of massive social programs not as expenditures, but as investments that would somehow pay for themselves through a vague multiplier effect. However, as Senator Kennedy methodically demonstrated, the transition from theory to practice is where the MMT framework often collapses. The fundamental flaw, as highlighted in the Senate chamber, is the assumption that the government possesses the precision to perfectly calibrate the money supply in real time. Kennedy's interrogation forced a confrontation with the reality of fiscal gravity. If the government injects $5 trillion annually into the economy, as her plans suggested, while only recouping $600 billion through taxation, the remaining $900 billion represents a massive increase in the monetary base. In a standard economic model, this excess liquidity chasing a finite supply of goods and services leads inevitably to the erosion of purchasing power. The calculator moment exposed the fact that the Congresswoman had embraced the spending side of MMT without fully accounting for the taxing side required to prevent a currency crisis. By asking her to show the work on a simple retail device, Kennedy stripped away the academic jargon of MMT and revealed the underlying structural deficit that would, in a real-world scenario, likely lead to the very economic instability she sought to prevent. Chapter 4: The Physical Impossible, Solar Volts, and the Limits of Geography. One of the most devastating segments of the inquiry involved the deconstruction of the residential solar energy mandate. This portion of the discussion moved the debate from the realm of abstract finance into the realm of physical reality and engineering. The Congresswoman had frequently cited the rapid adoption of solar panels as the primary mechanism for achieving carbon neutrality. On the surface, the proposal is aesthetically and morally appealing, replacing fossil fuel consumption with the clean, infinite energy of the sun. However, the senator's use of EPA and CBO data introduced a level of material reality that the policy's proponents had seemingly ignored. The math was relentless. If an average residential solar array can only offset a few tons of CO2 annually, and the national goal is the reduction of 2 billion tons, the sheer volume of required installations exceeds the total number of existing residential structures in the United States by a factor of 3. This calculation revealed a profound geographic illiteracy within the proposal. It assumed that every house, regardless of its location, roof orientation, or local climate, could be converted into a high-efficiency power plant. It ignored the reality of the American Northeast, where winter sunlight is scarce, or the dense urban environments where individual roof space is non-existent. Furthermore, the cost analysis conducted by Kennedy's team suggested that the financial burden of such a mandate, reaching $12.5 trillion for a single component of the Green New Deal, would exceed the total annual GDP of many developed 8 nations. This was not a matter of political will or moral courage, as the Congresswoman often claimed. It was a matter of physics and the physical limitations of the national housing stock. The silence that followed this revelation was perhaps the most telling moment of the hearing, as it became clear that the policy had been formulated without a basic audit of the nation's physical infrastructure. Chapter V. The Amazon HQ2 Debacle. A case study in theoretical versus tangible opportunity. The senator's decision to pivot the discussion toward the Congresswoman's own district provided a localized and tangible example of the consequences of anti-math policy making. The Amazon HQ2 project, which had been slated for Long Island City, represented a significant moment in the economic history of New York's 14th district. The project promised 25,000 high-paying jobs, billions of dollars in long-term tax revenue, and the transformation of an underutilized industrial area into a global technology hub. The Congresswoman's opposition was rooted in a theoretical objection to corporate subsidies. The idea that the $3 billion in tax incentives offered by the city and state was money that could be spent elsewhere. Kennedy's critique of this position was surgically precise. He pointed out the fundamental misunderstanding of how tax incentives function. The $3 billion did not exist in a vault waiting to be spent. It was a future discount on taxes that Amazon would only pay if they moved to the district. By opposing the deal, the district did not save $3 billion to spend on schools or infrastructure. Instead, it lost the $27 billion in new tax revenue that the project was projected to generate over 2 decades. The calculator logic here was undeniable. In an area suffering from high unemployment, the rejection of 25,000 jobs based on a misunderstanding of fiscal incentives was presented by Kennedy as a catastrophic failure of basic economic literacy. This segment of the hearing reframed the Congresswoman not as a protector of the working class, but as a theorist whose lack of mathematical grounding had cost her own constituents a generational opportunity for upward mobility.